Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Bienvenue à l'Université Concordia. I'm Graham Carr. I'm the Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies here at the university. Many thanks to the Globe and Mail and our Alumni Association for their support of tonight's event. As many of you know, if you've been here to previous events in this series, Thinking Out Loud is a conversation series about topics that matter to the public. It's partly about connecting Concordia research to members of the public, but it's also about connecting that work with the views of experts, high-profile experts from outside the university who bring a different perspective, who bring a different kind of public engagement to the issues at hand. And the beauty of a conversation is that it opens up time to delve more deeply into ideas, to share opinions, to exchange views, to mull things over, to follow promising leads and provocative strands of thought that suddenly open up in the course of talking out loud. There's something illuminating about a good conversation, and there's always the possibility of an unexpected discovery or revelation. And tonight's conversation is all about discoveries, following leads, taking the time to dissect, to mull things over, to analyze, to hypothesize. Tonight, we're thinking out loud about the science of crime, about forensic toxicology, and the stories that it can tell. So let's get started, shall we? Please join me in welcoming the moderator for tonight's event from the Globe and Mail, André Picard. Always great to see you, André. And our conversationalists this evening from Concordia's Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, Professor Cameron Skinner, and Brigitte Desharnais, a doctoral student who works with Cameron. And joining them, of course, we are thrilled to welcome author and forensic anthropologist, Dr. Kathy Reichs. Have a great evening, everyone. Enjoy the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Graham. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde d'être ici ce soir. Thank you all for coming out tonight in such great numbers. We have a full house. As you heard, what we're going to do tonight is have a conversation. We're going to talk about all kinds of things. We're going to talk about science, about forensics, about crime, about death, about bones, about writing, and many other topics of interest. And we have three distinguished guests to join in our conversation. I know many of you have attended Thinking Out Loud events because I recognize many familiar faces when I was mingling out there, but just let me briefly remind you of the format. As I said, I'll kick off the conversation. We'll just chat for a while, for about an hour. Then there'll be a question period. There's two mics, one on either side. We'll raise up the house lights so we can see you then. We can't really see you now, but we know you're out there. And then at about a little after we finish up, we'll let Kathy freshen up, and then she'll be out front to sign books. A couple of her wonderful books are out there for sale, and you can get those afterwards and get them signed. So without further ado, let's get started. And I thought I'd start the conversation with something really basic. We have three scientists with us, so I thought I'd just ask you how you got interested in science, each of you. Brigitte, maybe you can kick us off as the youngest of our group. What brought you to science in the first place?
It's a bit of a boring answer, I think, because I really don't remember like the point where I started being interested in science for as long as I can remember. I was always interested by those classes and just the discovery aspect of science.
So it sounds like it came naturally. It wasn't,
yes.
Which is good for the younger generation. We used to think that girls and women were pushed away from science, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
No, I don't think so. I've never felt. I've never felt that I couldn't study science because I was a woman, or that it was something that was frowned upon. Not at all.
Great. Well, we'll come back to that a little later on in our talk. But Cameron, what got you interested in the sciences?
Just to add to that, in fact, a lot of our classes, the majority of the people are women, and I think it's great. But getting back to me, when I was a wee little fellow. In high school, I had a great science teacher, and I had a couple great science teachers, and they sort of lit the fire. And it has burned intermittently, but it has burned steadily for my entire career. And I'm very pleased I can sort of pass that on to other students, either by terrorizing them in class or by inspiring them. I'm not sure which, but I try.
Maybe a little of both.
Yes.
But it's good that you mentioned the importance of education and the importance of teachers as role models. That's really key. And I imagine everybody here has a story, good or bad, about a teacher and the influence they had on their career.
Yes, no doubt.
So Kathy, tell us how you got interested in science.
It's hard, again, like, as Brigitte said, it's hard to pinpoint. When I was a kid, I was always interested in natural science. I didn't know the term at the time, but I wanted to be out catching frogs or catching snakes and not inside playing with dolls or games and things like that. And then when I went to my high school reunion, which was, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, they listed what everybody was doing, and people came up to me and said, "Oh, you're finishing a PhD in archaeology." And they said, you were always interested in that throughout high school. You were always reading books about archaeology. And I don't remember that. But apparently it carried from the frogs and snakes to archaeology, and then the rest is history.
Yeah. And what is the history? How do you move from archaeology to forensic anthropology?
Well, I focused in graduate school, my degree is in physical anthropology with a specialty in the human skeleton. And I planned to work with ancient skeletons, and I did so early in my career. But back in those days, and I'm not going to tell you how far back those days were, but there was...
I think we established 5 years ago.
It's 5-6 years, somewhere in that. There was no formal process of board certification for being a forensic scientist. So when police would find bones, they'd say, well, what do we do with them? Well, let's take them out to that bones lady at the university. So I got into forensics really by being dragged into it. They just would bring cases to me, and then I found that very compelling. It had a relevance for me that archaeology didn't, that you could actually give answers to a family or give a name to an unknown person, and I liked that, so I retrained, took my board certification.
And not everyone here has expertise, so forensic anthropology, that's what it is, right? It's the study of bodies and skeletons that are decomposed and burned, dismembered, mummified, all that fun stuff. You don't deal with the freshly dead.
Well, I do in some... Are they sneaking out? We can't.
I just want them to feel, at ease that there's not going to be some cutting up here.
No demonstration, no
Okay.
live demos. Well, if you've ever seen an opening sequence for bones, it's a body that it is, in some way it's messed up. And it could be fresh tissue, but for some reason the pathologist can't do a regular autopsy. And therefore any information that we're going to get from the body is going to come from the bones. And that's where the forensic anthropologist comes in.
And Brigitte, you got interested in this area, I understand, from reading books, like Kathy's books, Patricia Cromwell, for example.
Yes, when I was starting high school, I read Patricia Cornwell's books, and I wanted to be a forensic pathologist at that point. Like, this is what I wanted to do. I also read Reichs' book. It was my first full adult English book that I read. And then when I started chemistry at the end of high school, I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. Chemistry is so cool. And then somehow I just stumbled back onto forensic practice, but in chemistry and toxicology. So.
And you do toxicology research mostly. What does that mean?
Mostly, yes. So I've done several things. I've done developing methods to quantify cyanide into blood and gastric contents, or developing methods to analyze drugs in different biological fluids more rapidly. But now my PhD research, what I'm doing is characterizing and quantifying enzymes in the liver that metabolizes drug. And so we're hoping with that to have an estimate of how quickly the victims were metabolizing the drugs when they were living. And so that can tell us a lot of things about the circumstances that surround the death of this individual.
So what can it tell us? Can it tell us that they overdosed, for example? Is that the kind of information it gives you?
Whether they overdosed or not, we can tell by quantifying the drugs in the blood of the victim. But the technique I'm developing, what it can tell really is, for example, if you have someone die in a hospital setting of an overdose, well, the question might be, is it because of a medical error? So the doctor just gave too high a dose to the patient, or is it just because this person doesn't metabolize quickly enough the drugs that he or she was given. And so this is where this techniques comes in and can say, no, this person was metabolizing at a regular rate or was not metabolizing rapidly enough, and therefore this is not a medical error. So that's the...
Or maybe it was murder.
Yeah.
We never know. Now, Cameron, you do bioanalytical chemistry. Can you explain that simply what it is?
How long have we got?
About 30 seconds.
Oh, geez. No, okay. Well, bioanalysis is just a very broad field where we look at molecules, the molecular species that are in biological organisms, such as you, me, plants, trees, that sort of thing. And it's a real challenging area because if we just look at proteins for the sake of argument, you and I are made up of all sorts of proteins, but our genome codes for about 50,000 proteins. And with 50,000 different types of proteins available, it's a real formidable challenge to try and isolate, identify, and quantitate these. And the reason why we're interested is, for example, if you're up on stage and you're under stress, certain proteins go up in regulation and some are suppressed in regulation. On the other hand, if you're suffering from a disease, for example, others go up and others go down. And these can be used as means of identifying diseases, and also, more importantly, for the biologists, they can identify, well, if this protein is upregulated and this one is down, that tells us that this pathway has been changed, and maybe that's a target for a drug to cure this disease. And so I try and develop instrumentation and methods of analysis that can challenge and take apart these very complicated samples and break them down into signals that we can measure and record and understand.
And you build essentially fancy machines to measure this stuff.
Yes. Unlike the ones you get to see on bones, mine are mostly, it looks pretty rough. But we do have nifty things. We have lasers and high voltage power supplies and all that sort of good stuff. But yes, we build it from scratch, and we take the fundamental principles of optics and physics and electronics and chemistry and analytical chemistry and bring them together in new and unusual ways in order to produce instrumentation that is superior to what's commercially or currently available. And our current task is that we want to analyze a complicated biological sample with about 5,000 proteins in it. And the best commercial instrumentation right now that would be sort of comparable can handle about 200 to maybe 500 proteins. So we're trying to do an order of magnitude. And with that, hopefully, that'll be a very valuable tool to unlocking these complicated biological problems.
Well, I'll watch for that machine to show up on bones.
I'm sure we have it.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, Hodgins has one ordered.
Bring at least 2 trucks.
Great. Now, Kathy, I'm interested in, we have a full house. There's a lot of interest in forensics and forensic science. Where does that all stem from? Does it go back to the OJ era, or what? Where did it all start?
It seems to me that that's about the timing is right. And you mentioned an author. I'm sorry, I wasn't familiar with it. So that was beginning in the mid-90s. We had the OJ trial where everybody was exposed 24, at least, I don't know if that was true in Canada, but 24/7, wall to wall. We heard about blood spatter patterns and knife trajectories, and so I think maybe that was the source of when people started saying, there are people that do this in labs. Let's think about it and read about it.
And is that a good thing? Is that a good way of exposing people to science?
That depends on what you're watching or what you're reading. I think there are some shows that handle it very well, and books, and then others that handle it not so well.
And what's good and what distinguishes them? Is it accuracy?
Yeah, accuracy, plausibility. When you're writing fiction and you're writing science for fiction, it has to be brief and it has to be entertaining and has to be jargon-free. You can't use acronyms and special terminology. So there's a skill to doing that, to getting that correct in the formula for the book or for the script or whatever it is you're writing. So I think the good ones do that well and also maintain the accuracy.
But that's it. You do all that, but you still get the science right, which is not
right.
that usual, I have to say.
Yeah, and I think it's a skill similar to addressing a jury. You don't want to dumb it down, but you want to put it in language that's understandable, and you also want to keep the reader, the juror's attention, so it has to be moderately entertaining.
And I'm interested in the other scientists on the panel. Do you read the vulgarisation, the common stuff, and say, oh, well, this isn't accurate, or this is? How do you read it when you read science in the popular press? Or
Sometimes.
My kids won't watch television with me.
Okay.
If there's any forensics in it, I'll be going, you can't. Let's see, just be quiet and watch it.
Yes, that's pretty much the same thing with my boyfriend. I mean, there are a few shows that we watch together, and I was like, this is impossible. Like, this is not a standard technique. They can't do this in 20 minutes. That won't happen. But
I look very enviously at that. Boy, I want that instrument. It does it all in 20 minutes. I could use that in my lab. But nobody seems to sell them.
Yeah.
it's magic. That's the first time in all our chats up on stage that I've heard the terminology instrument envy, but I'll have to remember it. But you also read medical journals and scientific journals. Mm-hmm. I read them for my work too, and they're largely unreadable. Is that, is that?
Our work is done.
I don't know. Is that wrong? Should it be better? Should they be better written, the medical stuff, or is that written for a specific audience?
Well, it's written for
it's
content, I
specific
think.
Absolutely.
But what can be really distracting, and I remember when I first wrote fiction, when I wrote Déjà Dead, when you're writing for medical journals or scientific journals, you have to cite everything, and there are all those citations in the middle. And I remember I'd be writing something, fiction, and I'd think, oh gosh, can I say that? And then I think, well, hell yeah, I can say anything I want. This is fiction, So on you go. So that makes it harder, I think, to read that fluidly.
If you try that in science literature, you get your fingers slapped.
Yeah.
I mean, the paper articles are for a specific audience, but I'd say there's a diversity of quality of writing, even in the scientific papers. I know that some authors, I'll really enjoy reading the paper and it reads like a story, well, at least to me. But some others, it's heavily technical and not very clear. And so, there's good and bad writing in there too.
One of the things I always warn all of my students as they progress through their degree as they get closer to the thesis writing step is writing the thesis is one of the hardest things you will ever do. And writing a good quality thesis that's easy to read, easy to understand, has everything in there and is referenced correctly is really tough.
And it might sell the movie rights too.
Not in my lab.
I kind of make the distinction, if it has footnotes, then it's not leisure reading.
Yeah.
And how can you go back to science writing now, or have you become too good at explaining things properly? If I could put it that way.
I think we're being dissed here.
Are you asking me?
Sure, yeah.
No, I don't. It's like falling off a horse. No, it's like riding a horse, Yeah, I think I could go back and do it.
And do you still do it? Do you still do the
It's really hard, just time-wise, because I do a Temperance Brennan book every year, a young adult book every year, and a script. So there's just isn't the time to fit anything else in.
And do you manage to get back into the lab, into the autopsy room, the stinky room? Do you miss all those?
Occasionally. I do a lot less than I was at one point. But yeah, occasionally I still do. I always would find myself caught in a dilemma, because when I wouldn't get a call from whoever, the lab or an attorney or whoever wanted expertise, I would think, well, what the heck? Why am I? And then when I would get a call, I'd think, well, I don't have time for this. I can't go. So I was never happy.
Nobody seems to die on schedule. That's the problem.
Yeah, except my schedule.
Yes, exactly right.
And what about you, Brigitte? Will you make that crossover where we're going to see your book on famous toxicologist solving crimes?
that. That's not in my plans for now. I don't think that will happen.
Well, maybe Kathy will talk you into it.
Yeah,
into
we'll
the
talk.
bank.
We'll talk.
What else should we talk about? I don't want to stick too closely to my script, but so let me return to the science stuff a little bit. I want to talk more about writing, but I want to talk to all of you about science some more. And Cameron, I was reading the story in, we won't mention the paper, the Globe and Mail, who pays my salary, but in the Globe story setting up this event, you said something interesting. You said our job as scientists is to connect the dots. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that. What does that mean and why is it important?
Well, I think that as we'd go through research, and that's our primary output at the university, we always have this goal way off in the far away distance of resolving a problem. And usually we're way back here in the Stone Age trying to get between the two, and we drag in theory, so we understand how optics and electronics and all those sorts of things work. And we begin developing experiments to develop information that will guide us in developing for our case, instrumentation and methodologies that will ultimately get us to our goal. And it's a systematic approach towards problem solving, and that is the essence of science. It's not a haphazard approach. It's not I get up in the one morning and I've got the theory of everything. It's a very slow, methodical process, and it also is a critical component of that is teaching young scientists how to be very critical of their own work and be very suspicious of good answers. Which is something that is maybe not so common in the common population. If you get the right answer, you think, wow, this is perfect, I've done something great, I know what I'm doing. Whereas in science, you usually wonder, how did my experiment fail to give me this answer that looks right? And usually there's a failure somewhere in there that you haven't noticed. And it can be a very frustrating time, though, because it's so slow. It's very tempting to leap ahead and jump over the necessary steps to get to the answer. But it's critically important that we get all the dots connected in between before we get to that answer. Otherwise, you're sort of standing on this very unstable result. And there have been some very good examples in science where people have jumped too far ahead and tried to explain something with a theory that doesn't have the right foundations.
And connecting the dots, that sounds a bit like what you do in crime fiction.
Well, and in crime solving as well. I think of myself as a dot. I'm one person. I don't solve anything on my own. I work with one particular type of evidence. In my case, that evidence is the victim, him or herself. So I'm one dot, and then I also work with the toxicology people who are another dot, and then I'll work with the DNA people, or I'll work with, some other specialty area, ballistics or whatever it happens to be. And then the whole team connects those dots and hopefully comes up with a solution to whatever the question is, who is it, or what happened to that person.
And we sometimes forget that science is very much teamwork.
Mm-hmm. Very much, yeah.
And when you read crime fiction, I read lots of crime fiction, it tends to be about a person rather than a team. Does that perpetuate that notion that there's this star who does everything?
Well, that's one of the big fallacies when I watch shows, which I won't name, but you have the same person who goes to the crime scene and collects the remains, then goes back to the lab and does the analysis, and then goes out with the detective and interviews witnesses, and it really doesn't work that way. CSI techs go to the crime scene, collect the evidence, bring them back, they're done. Then the lab scientists do their analysis. They primarily work in the lab, then they're done. That's one of the fallacies that's...
Well, and the other big one on TV and to a lesser extent in books is that things happen magically and quickly.
This is true. They do happen quickly, but we only have, I forget what it is now. We used to have 52 minutes.
I think
now
you're down to 48.
Down to like 48 minutes or something like that. And you've got to wrap it up. It's a formula. Just like writing a thriller is a formula. In my books, somebody gets killed and somebody gets caught. So you have to, what's fun is working through that. And I think trying to from the point of view of the viewer or the reader, trying to figure out who done it before the author tells you. And I know when I'm reading a thriller, if I do figure it out, I'm a little bit disappointed in the author. They should have that twist. They should have that something unique that happens that surprises me.
Yeah, you don't want to figure it out too early.
Yeah.
That's the way I prepare my exams, the same way. Very popular.
Yeah.
Yes, I heard your students describing them as thrillers here.
Yes. Potential murder case, too.
There you go. And Brigitte, talk a bit about the time, because we discussed this earlier that,
Yes.
you know, on CSI, the tests are done within 15 minutes, for example. And how long does
Yes.
it actually take to do a toxicology test, for example?
I would say for toxicology and CSI it's even quicker. Usually the body is still on the table and they have the tox result, which is always maddening to me. But I mean, in the real world, in the forensics lab in Montreal, the target is 90% of the toxicology reports out in 90 days. And it's not particularly slow compared to other labs. It's just standard, and it's standard in other fields of forensic practice too. That's just the way it is. I mean, if you have to do not only your screening, but your confirmation to make sure that you have your right answer, and then maybe search for a few molecules that aren't standard, well then, you know, it's quite standard to get to a month or 2 months. There has been one pilot project in Toronto, in the Center of Forensic Science in Toronto, where they do stat testing for toxicology. So it's toxicology in 24 hours. So they get the body, they get the sample, they do the tox in 24 hours, and they get preliminary results out to the forensic pathologist. But that was a pilot project, and that's only preliminary result. It's not confirmed results. So, I mean, there are different degrees of certainty of reports that you can have, and so yeah, it takes time.
And isn't a lot of that just queuing up, waiting for your turn for the analysis?
Not that much. Usually we're pretty much up to speed, but it's just getting the first screen done, then it waits for the professional toxicologist to order more analyses, and then it goes back into analysis and then goes back to, so just circling through the analysis process just takes time.
But isn't the science, Cameron, isn't the science getting much better? The equipment, we know a lot more stuff, can't we?
Yes, absolutely. I would say 15 or 20 years ago, sort of the premier mass spec instrumentation, which was capable of analyzing these drugs, would be able to do maybe 20 or 30 different metabolites or drugs at the same time. Brigitte and I have developed a method, what's doing how many now?
We have 60 in the same method, but
yes.
It's even evolved now where it's like, I think 130 in the same.
And so the numbers are coming up, and also the quality of the results is getting better. Our ability to detect lower and lower concentrations is getting better, and also the ability to take on a wider variety of samples and still get quality results is getting much better. In the good old days, you had to be sort of like a high priestess of mass spectrometry, and you had to treat the instrument very carefully, and it didn't like certain matrices and loved other matrices, and you had to be very, very careful. And now they're much more robust, and they're much more capable. Unfortunately, this also comes at a much higher cost. The instrumentation is always going up in its capabilities, and its price tag seems to be sort of exponentially related. But if you need these results, and these instruments are designed for high throughput to keep up with the demand, what price?
So let's talk about money a bit. Does forensics, does pathology get, it's kind of not marginal, but sort of off to the side. It's not mainstream science. Does it get adequate funding, or is it a lot of these weights have to do with just not enough money in the system?
Well, I mean, one thing is that, unfortunately, often money follows catastrophes. That's what happened in Ontario, basically, is that they had this case with Charles Smith, the pathologist, who did so many erroneous reports, and there was a commission that looked into forensic science in Ontario and said there is a problem here, and we need to invest into our forensic science system. And they got a lot of money. They built a brand new lab with that. They hired personnel, and they have they have like a beautiful lab full of equipment.
Lab envy.
Yes, lab envy now.
And so, but it's too bad that this happens, because I mean, on the other side, and I know I'm speaking from like a jealous standpoint here, and I'm fully conscious of that. But in the meantime, the lab in Quebec does what it can to the best of its ability, and does it with the little money that it has, and you never get any increase in budget because you haven't screwed up so big that it gets into the press, right? So that's a bit disappointing, but
I got a plan. We'll talk later.
That's an interesting career path to plan. But and Kathy, what are your thoughts on the money issue? Is it?
I think every lab would tell you they're underfunded, and that's probably true.
Yes.
It's getting better in the U.S. There's a lot more congressional, and forensic scientists have kind of organized and hired their own lobbyists and things to make sure that their argument to the government, to Congress, is heard, that forensic science does get a bigger piece of the pie.
And I imagine the profile on TV and books, that helps. You're not starting from zero anymore.
That helps. I mean, now the congressmen actually know what forensic science is, so, yeah.
And they know very little else, I have to say.
Yeah.
But I read, for example, that the number of autopsies is way down. We do a lot fewer autopsies than we used to. Does stuff like that matter, or?
Well, it can matter, yeah. I mean, if you have to triage whether to do just an external, no autopsy, just an external, or do a full, internal autopsy, often budget does come into play, I suspect. I don't make those decisions. But.
And for those of us who are lay people, why is an autopsy important? What does it tell us?
Autopsies are done in situations of violent death. If you have suspicion of homicide or accidental death or suicide, then there's something called sudden and unexpected death. A young person, 31 years old, drops dead on the basketball court or the hockey rink. So you want to be sure that those don't slip through the cracks, that you know exactly what happened, what was the cause of death, in fact.
Okay. And with the purpose being to help prevent these in the future, presumably.
Yeah, to nail the guilty and exonerate the innocent, and right. And of course, there are issues with insurance, and there are all kinds of legal issues with any death. And let's talk about writing a bit, because I know a lot of people are interested in your books. That's why they've come out tonight. Where did the writing bug come from? I was watching some of your interviews on YouTube, and I saw that you actually wrote a novel when you were 9. Oh, dear God. I wrote 2. I actually wrote 2, and I totally...
Yes, one was a romance and one was a thriller.
romance,
okay.
Yeah. And the other was a mystery. But then I totally forgot about that. And then I was in the science lab. So there must have been some interest in writing when I was a little kid. They were handwritten in pencil, and I illustrated them with those little colored pencils that you used to buy. I made full professor at the university, so I was free to do whatever I wanted to do. And And I had just worked on a serial murder case here in Montreal, so I kind of had the freedom to try something new. And I had the core idea for a story. I just take little nuggets from experiences or cases I've worked on. And I don't know if you know this, but university faculty are not overly well paid. I don't know if you've...
I'm not going to argue that point, no.
So I thought it also might... I had a colleague at the university in North Carolina that was writing straight to paperback books, and she was making a nice little sum on the side doing that. So I thought, I'll give it a try. And I did.
No regrets?
No regrets. It worked out well.
And how was it difficult? People often, everybody thinks, I've got a book in me, or at least one. Was it hard, the process at first? Did it come naturally?
It was hard in that I have no training in creative writing, so I was just making it up. And so I just used as a template the kind of book I like to read. So the other hard part was finding time, because I was teaching full time and commuting between North Carolina and Montreal and doing casework and had, kids and all those things. So I would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and I would write for and I am not a morning person. And I would write for a couple of hours and then go on to campus, or I would write on weekends, or I would write on summer vacations. And my kids would sort of tiptoe around, go, "Oh, Mom's working on her novel." Yeah, they don't do that anymore. So it took 2 years to write the first book.
And that's relatively quick for a lot of people.
I guess, I don't know.
No, I think it is.
Yeah.
I get to talk to lots of authors, and some it's a decade in the making, and
Right. Yeah.
that's not unusual.
Yeah.
And does it get easier, or does it get tougher?
Some things get easier because especially when you're doing a continuing character series. I just released the 18th of the Temperance Brennan books. So you've got your core characters. You really know your main character, her voice and what she'd say and what she'd do. So that part gets easier. It is a thriller, so there is a certain formula to it, as I said earlier. It gets harder in that you have to, with every single book, that may be the first Temperance Brennan book that someone picks up, or it may be the 18th. So you have to reintroduce your central premise and your characters, but you don't want to bore the returning reader, so you have to do it in a new and creative way every single time. And that I've had her being cross-examined on the stand, which brings out the information. I've had her bored at a faculty meeting. I don't know if you know, faculty meetings can be really boring. So she starts writing her autobiography. You have to figure out a different way to not just say, this is Temperance Brennan and this is what she does, and so that gets harder.
And does it get harder to find new ideas? How do you mine for ideas?
That does not get harder. I always draw, I think most writers do, well, unless you're setting it, science fiction off and the titans of some, what's the name of that planet they just figured out? It doesn't matter. So I always draw on an experience or something from a case, or sometimes I'll take a nugget from one case and combine it with something from another case, and I just start with that core idea. A couple of years ago, I went to Afghanistan on a USO tour to thank the troops for their service there. So that was such a moving experience that I used that. So you take that and you mix it up with other things, and then you spin off. You say, well, what if this happened? What if that happened? What if that? And then you spin off into fiction. But I always change all the names and the dates and the places for legal and ethical reasons.
But many of your stories come from actual cases. Your first book was based on the serial murderer in Quebec, for example.
Yes.
So do you read a lot of news media, crime stories, things like that for inspiration?
I do. I attend professional meetings, and I'm never in my own section because I tend to network with other forensic anthropologists. They're always in the bar, so I tend to network with them. But I'll go sit in on toxicology, or I'll go sit in on jurisprudence, or sit in on the dental section or something, get ideas, because I don't want to just use nothing but anthropology in my books. I try in each book. What I write are good old-fashioned murder mysteries, but the solution is science-driven. So I like to use lots of different kinds of forensic science.
Okay. And Brigitte, you started young reading crime fiction. Do you still read it?
The little that I can with the time that is given to me by my master.
She's looking at you. Directly at you.
Laser beams.
Yes, I read what I can.
We'll have to talk to your advisor about allowing you to be more well-rounded.
No.
And Cameron, do you delve into the crime fiction at all?
Well, no, not terribly.
Strictly the Journal of Chemistry, that's it?
Yeah, well, analytical chemistry is like right there. No, I think I only had one book in me, and that was my thesis, and I'm done. For which many readers will be appreciative, I think. No, the scientific literature is kind of where I have my outlet. I don't have any sort of creative outlet of that nature. And like I say, I think many people.
Paper and
Well, yes, there are grad students' papers. I edit a little bit.
But we talk about the importance of bringing science to the masses,
Yes.
and that. How do you do that in things like chemistry and forensics and toxicology? How do you bring it to the public, if not through novels and TV series? Are there other ways?
Certainly there are, and I think Brigitte is the expert in this area.
Yes, well, I mean, I do several times a year. I go into high schools and just do workshops on different areas of forensic science. And so usually I have like a 1 hour. I ask them which theme they want me to cover, and I do a 1 hour talk on the science that we do and cases, and you adapt it to the level. A few years back, I went to Eureka Festival and did a presentation there too, and so that's more for kids and families, and so you adjust the level of your, what you're talking about, and I think that pretty much anything can be explained even to little kids. It's just the level of light that you you put in there that differs, but yes.
And you do things like you were judging the science fair today, for example.
Yes.
There's other ways of engaging young people.
For sure.
And what about scientific literacy? We talk a lot about that. People are less scientifically literate today, but they're more interested in science than ever. Is there a paradox there? How do you see that?
Gosh, I don't know. No.
I see a real divide, and it continues to open between the people who have sort of the scientific technical know-how and then the common people who don't. And it's a real shame because an awful lot of the principles behind science are very rudimentary, very intuitive. It's very difficult to intuit out of the box, but once it's been explained, especially if it's been explained well, and that's why there's such a great need for great science teachers, especially at the introductory levels. They can explain things, they can encourage people to pursue a career in science or technology or creative literature who turn into scientists and people who are able to relate science to the common person. And there's a lot of great journals out there that do this, like New Scientist and Scientific American. They're sort of that intermediate between the technical and the lay. And I am very envious of people who can write efficiently for those people, for those journals, because I certainly don't have that ability. But I think it's critical. Our society is becoming more and more reliant on technology and sophisticated technology and sophisticated science. And if people don't understand the basics, it's a very precarious situation.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a paradox, though. I think that maybe the interest for science comes first, and then having the know-how to distinguish good studies from bad studies, is a step further, and it takes more to do that. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily a paradox.
Mm-hmm.
But I can identify what Brigitte says. I write a young adult series, which is geared towards middle school up through high school. And so I write them with my son, and we started writing them for two different reasons. One is I would have parents come to signings and say, my daughter really enjoys your books, forensics or watches bones, can she read your books, your Temperance Brennan books? And I'd say, well, how old is your daughter? And she'd say 7. And I'd say, no, absolutely not. So we decided that we would build on that interest in forensics and write a young adult series and show particularly a young girl. It's Temperance Brennan's 14-year-old great niece, Tori Brennan, and her friends. And they're interested in science, and they use science to solve cold cases and mysteries and things. So the books are used a lot by teachers in schools to supplement middle school or high school level science and show this is what you could, you don't just have to learn chemistry or biology. This is what you can do with it. Yeah. This is something that you can actually hope to achieve with it. So that's been fun. And going to the schools is such a kick. We do a lot of talks in middle schools and high schools, and the kids ask the best questions.
Yes, really.
Yeah, keep you on your toes.
Yeah, and I guess the key is making it so it's not a chore. Often the way we teach science in schools is that it's a chore, and if you make it something they can relate to.
Yeah, and with a plot, too.
Yeah. And do Do you see people who read your books have to have a certain amount of scientific literacy? Is that fair? Or?
No, I don't think they do. And hopefully they read them so they can learn something about science. I mean, they have to be literate to read the books. But I don't think it requires a knowledge of science. It requires, I think, an interest in science because, as I said, that's what drives the solution. But
when I was asking the initial question, I was thinking more that there's such an embrace these days of quackery, you know, of just stuff that's just not scientifically based or realistic. And I always have trouble, you know, fitting that with how does that fit into our great interest with actual science on TV and in books. It seems odd to me, that mixture.
Yeah.
Well, yes, but there's also kind of the opposite force that you see too in certain blogs like Pharmacien or anyways, different people online that are actually trying to increase scientific literacy and vulgarize better science. And so I'm not sure if there's an increase per se in quackery or it's just we see it more because of all the diffusion means that we have through internet. So I maybe it was always there, but we just see it more now.
Yeah, I guess the internet allows you to seek out things that you already believe to confirm whatever you believe, no matter how wacky, among other things.
Yes. Yes, it allows them to congregate, and that's the problem.
Yeah. And Kathy, your new book actually talks a lot about the internet, about cyber sleuthing. How did you come across that?
I stumbled across web sleuthing because when my son and I were researching our third book or fourth book in the young adult series, it's about geocaching. And geocaching is a game you play online. There are probably geocaches. You can go in, put your zip code in, and it'll tell you where these geocaches are located. Mm-hmm. You know, probably there are 15 of them within a block of here.
I think there's one under your chair.
Yeah, I noticed that. Is that what fell before?
Yeah, that was my geocache.
So while we were researching geocaching for the young adult book, I stumbled across web sleuthing. And web sleuthing is also, I wouldn't call it a game. It's got a little bit more serious goal in mind. But web sleuths will go online and they will visit sites that list unidentified human remains that have been found wherever. And then they go on sites that list missing persons. And they try to match them up. Geographically, they try to give names to these nameless, unidentified dead that are lying around in medical examiner offices or wherever they happen to be. So I thought, well, that's interesting. I think my readers might find that fascinating.
And you give them a fairly favorable portrayal in the book.
The one in the book, yes, and I think there are some that are very good, and I don't think law enforcement has a problem as long as they stay within the web sleuthing boundaries and stay online. Now, the character in my book takes it quite a bit further.
Kicks it up a notch or two.
Yeah, she kicks it up, she goes out to the scene, she collects remains, that sort of thing. So I don't think law enforcement would appreciate that. But there have been some cases that have been helped, cold cases especially, that have been helped by web sleuths.
Now, in Canada, a lot of cold cases that get a lot of attention are the whole issue of missing, murdered Indigenous women. Can something like that, you're familiar with some of those stories, can forensics, can that help in this, you know, it's a major social issue that needs resolving and discussion. Does forensics have a role to play there?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. And I treated this in my, I forget what, Bones Are Forever, which takes place out in Yellowknife, Edmonton and Yellowknife, where this is, you know, ground zero for that kind of problem. And certainly when any time there's criminal activity, whether it's murder, homicide, whatever, forensics can help resolve the situation, can help identify a victim, or can help, you know, identify cause or manner of death, or tie a suspect to a crime scene or a victim.
And in a case like this, where it's often people who are missing, there's no body, there's no bones, what could bones do with this?
Temperance Brennan bones, you mean? Well, she'd solve it in 48 minutes. She'd have the body, she'd have it in. Hodgins would rush in. My son says the show should actually be called Hodgins because, you know, at 46 minutes after the hour, Hodgins rushes in and he's got that hind leg from an extinct Paleolithic spider that only existed in one square acre of grass, and therefore we know who did it and where.
But is there science that can do that connect, help us find missing women?
I think science combined with good old-fashioned police legwork as well. I mean, science can't solve everything. Some of it, a lot of it, is still done by the investigating officers, and there has to be motivation for that, and funding, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So it comes back to the teamwork we talked about earlier.
Yes.
Okay. Can you give us a hint of what's coming next? People are always interested. People devour your books.
What's coming next? Hello. I'm working on a book right now, which is an off-series book. It's a non-Temperance Brennan book. It's a new main character, a new premise, a new setting. It'll be set in Charleston, South Carolina. So that'll be out in early 2017. There's a collection of short stories, Temperance Brennan short stories, coming out in November 1st, called The Bone Collection. And I'm doing something that's fun. I'm writing a short story with Lee Child, where we're going to bring Jack Reacher and Temperance Brennan together. So that'll be in a collection called Matchup, where they're bringing, it's the thriller writers, international thriller writers, and they're bringing together a male writer and protagonist with a female writer and protagonist. So.
Yeah. Sounds like The Bachelor of crime fiction.
There you go.
Oh, we'll have to watch for that one. What do you have coming out next, Brigitte?
Yes.
No, let me phrase it more seriously. So where do you want your career to take you? So the interest now in toxicology, where do you go with that?
Okay, I was going to say for hopefully my PhD soon, but
That'll be your first book.
Yes.
Well, I mean, after you have your PhD in chemistry, and I mean, I could go for trying to be a professor in a university. No, but seriously, the thing that I would really like to do is just be hired at the forensics lab here in Montreal and work in toxicology and just continue to do research in toxicology and work on cases. That would be perfect, actually.
Yeah. And I know you've published one book that I don't think it sold too well.
I'm not even sure the examiners read it. But anyway, no, I continue doing what I like to do, which is train young, bright scientists and develop new instrumentation. And so I'm really lucky. I've got the perfect job. I don't regret anything.
But talk a bit about what's the future of this, of analytical chemistry? Where could it go?
The big challenge in analytical science is tackling what's going on in biology, and to a lesser degree, what's going on in the environment. All the information we have about the environment all comes through analytical processes. So measuring PCBs in water and soil, for example, measuring ozone in the atmosphere, that's done through spectroscopy, measuring drugs and whatnot in wastewater treatment plants, that's done through mass spectrometry and liquid chromatography. So all of these areas of keen research interest, one of the key pillars that sits underneath that is the analytical sciences, and in particular analytical chemistry. And the good thing about analytical chemistry is that there's always people pushing the boundaries of asking questions, and so there's always a lag on the instrumentation. And that's kind of what I do. I like to develop instrumentation and methodologies to try and help these other researchers address the research questions they have.
So you mentioned the term lagging questions. It reminds me that I want to give the audience a chance to get some questions in for everyone. So we have 2 mics. Please ask questions rather than make soliloquies. We'll save those for the Shakespearean Festival. So ask questions, hopefully, to one of the panelists. There's a mic on my right and my left, and we're going to start with the mic on the right. So just line up when you're ready, and I'll try and pay attention so people can ask questions. Kathy, does there come a point where the character's done? Have you started to think, well, Temperance, I've said all I can say about her. I wondered if the hint that you're starting a new character, is that a hint that the other one's dying off? Or?
No, but I do think there's a time when the character's done. That's not why I'm doing an off-series book. I will go back and do at least one more Temperance Brennan book.
I think I heard a sigh of relief from the audience.
But we did get picked up for a 12th season for Bones,
wow.
But that is enough. So that will be our final season, because there is the time when a show should wrap it up.
And that's quite remarkable in itself. TV series often last 4 or 5 years
Yes.
if they're really good.
We are the longest running scripted drama in the history of Fox, so yeah.
Amazing. So let's start with a question here. And
I first have a question for Dr. Reichs. Well, I'm currently studying in anthropology to become forensic anthropologist, and considering that there's not that many of a high crime rate here, what made you choose Montreal, whereas you could have had a choice of many cities in the States?
I came to Montreal on what's called a National Faculty Exchange, and I taught at Concordia. I taught here a full academic year. And while I was here during that year, the lab was looking for someone who was board certified in forensic anthropology and could work in French. So, as I said at lunch today, I think there was a pool of one candidate, which was me, and I got the job. So that's why I started, and at the end of that year, when I went back to my home university in North Carolina, we struck up this arrangement whereby I would go back and forth every 6 weeks or so. So I did that for many, many, many years.
but I guess the subtext of that question was, wouldn't it be more exciting to work somewhere where there's more bones, where there's more crime?
Okay, well, no, you don't have as many guns, so you just have to be more creative. You're more into stabbing and bludgeoning than shooting. The reason you're right, I didn't really answer your question. The reason I came to Montreal is about a year earlier, I had decided that any educated person should speak French, and I did not. So instead of taking my lunch hour, I would go over and sit in on a French 101 class. It was very humbling. I was in there with my students, je m'appelle Kathy. So I had just taken this course in French 101, which is the basic, and this offer for the National Faculty Exchange came through at a faculty meeting. And there was a gentleman in Montreal that wanted to come to Charlotte. I thought, well, mais oui, I speak French now. And off I went.
Okay. Et ça me rappelle que si vous avez des questions en français pour les panélistes, ils sont bienvenus. Si on a des problèmes, on peut faire un peu de traduction, mais ils sont bienvenus dans les deux langues officielles. So let's go to a question over here.
Yes, hi. I watched a competing show for a long time, and one of the things that's been bugging me was every time they went to an investigation, they would walk into these very dark apartments or dark houses, and they would always run around with a flashlight. Is there a reason why they wouldn't put the lights on?
Yeah, that probably wasn't us, and the CSI technicians, I'm not naming shows, but the technicians were probably wearing pumps and pantyhose too, which is probably not too realistic.
What were the women wearing?
Yeah, exactly.
I thought the lights were always off because of luminol. We always wanted to see stuff in luminol.
That's it. They turned them off so they could spray luminol.
Great. Do you want to ask another question? Everybody else is shy. Go ahead.
Again, for Dr. Reich, I'll have some more for Brigitte afterwards. I don't know how much you'll be able to tell us about this, but is it true, well, it's a rumor, is it true that in the case of Cedrica Provencher, that was partly found back in December, that you're might come and take on that case here?
I did not work on that case. I believe the identification was a dental identification, but I didn't work on that case. So I'm always available if needed.
And for Brigitte, as I said before, I'm aiming for forensic anthropology, but I did a lot of research before I focused my bachelor in anthropology at Université de Montréal. You're a candidate at the PhD level here at Concordia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
How do you keep your focus in forensics, like at the PhD level? Because as far as I know, there's no forensics, here in Montreal.
No, in Quebec, there is one program at the university level in forensics, and that's the Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières. And even then, I think they haven't opened their graduate program yet. But I was lucky in that I was hired as a student at the forensics lab in Montreal. And so when I started my graduate studies, I'm a PhD candidate at Concordia, but I do all my research at the forensics lab in Montreal in the toxicology department. So that makes it quite easy to keep my focus on forensics work, because I have all the possible projects in front of me as I'm doing my research. So.
And the best place then to have experience in forensics would be the actual lab. It's pretty much the only place here, right?
Pretty much, yeah. The forensics lab in Montreal, Laboratoire de Sciences Judiciaires et Médecine Légale, it is the only lab that is doing forensics in Quebec. It's in the Partenay building, the ESQ building, but it's a completely separate entity from the Sûreté du Québec. So yes, usually what happens with all the professionals in all the departments is that they're house trained. And so basically, people get there with a degree in chemistry, in biology, in biochemistry, or even in physics for ballistics. And then they're house trained to be forensic toxicologist, forensic chemist, forensic expert in ballistic. So that's pretty much how it works, yes.
Good. So we'll give a chance to someone else to ask a question. Go ahead, and then I'll come back over here.
Thank you. A number of your books include religion as well as science. There are Catholicism, Judaism, Voodoo. What led you to link religions or include religions in your books as well? In addition to the science.
You're talking to Cameron or talking to
I haven't read his thesis, but I think it was in chemistry only.
That was science fiction, by the way.
Why do I use religion?
Well, what's the attraction or what's the interest in putting that in with the science as well? I think it's a very interesting juxtaposition at times.
Yeah, sometimes it just varies as to which book. The second book that I wrote, Death de Jour, partly addresses that because I had just done a case for the Catholic Church. I was hired by the Archdiocese of Montreal to exhume and analyze the remains of a woman named Jeanne Lebert, who died in 1714 and then was proposed for sainthood sometime in the 90s. So that gave rise to that book. That got me thinking about nuns, and that got me thinking about Catholicism and that sort of thing. The voodoo book, Devil Bones, I think, was that what it was called? Anybody read that? That was set in North Carolina, and we had some situations there along the coast. You get groups like the Santeria that have come up, through via Africa, through the Caribbean. So it can be a different trigger for whatever story it is I happen to be writing. Does that help at all?
And the new book has a...
And then there was a book which featured Orthodox, what's the one in Israel, Crossbones, which was really fun to research. I went to Israel for 2 weeks with a biblical archaeologist to research for that book and spent a lot of time crawling in tombs and things. So.
And the new book has a religious undercurrent.
It does. In North Carolina, we have this phenomenon on Brown Mountain. We have the mountains, the Blue Ridge Smoky Mountains, and these lights float around up there, and the government has organized geological survey studies, and they can't figure out how to explain the Brown Mountain lights. There are songs written about it and Cherokee legends about it. So I just thought it would be interesting to bring that in. We also have some really interesting religious groups up in the mountains, these snake handlers, for example. So to bring all of that together, as I said earlier, I start with bits and pieces of this little nugget and this little nugget, and then they're all kind of floating around in my head. It's like vegetable soup, kind of, and then I stir it up and a story emerges.
And in the Carolinas, the religion is omnipresent everywhere you look, so you can't avoid it.
Yeah, we're Bible Belt.
Yeah.
We're Bible Belt. I don't know if you're following our presidential...
Oh boy.
Yeah. I was so proud of that fellow. I'm proud of all of them, but anyway.
Great, go ahead.
So, unless you've been living under a rock, we all know about the series Making a Murderer, and I just want to know from the panel, how do you feel that the evidence in this case was portrayed against Stephen Avery, and basically if you just have any opinions about it in general?
Who's fielding that? Everybody watched that series, right?
Did you watch? Yeah, I thought so.
I can't really comment because my daughter-in-law's sister is involved in the defense of Brendan Dassey, so I think I'll just pass.
So Brigitte, we'll leave it to you.
Yeah, it's all yours now.
Take it away.
So what do you mean, the evidence in general, or the...
Yeah, well, there were a few aspects in the documentary itself, and there's been controversy about how well it was displayed to the general public, i.e. it was biased. So I'm wondering if is that your take from it? Do you have another opinion about it?
I mean, for sure, I thought the way it was presented, like, obviously it's a show, okay? It's there to make people think that obviously this guy was wrongfully convicted, and for sure he didn't do it. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some appalling investigative techniques that are presented in the documentary, and, you know, regardless of if the evidence presented is biased in a way or another, those techniques alone to me are enough to prompt an investigation into what happened there. I mean, but that's a general comment with regards to the US labs, is that you have the best and the worst, really. So you have extremely good labs in all aspects, and then you have small county labs that are underfunded, not connected to the research, not connected to the good practices of the domain, and they fall behind. And what you see with, like, evidence being kept in a locker behind, and, you know, not even being looked at, not even being logged anywhere, that's exactly what it is in some counties. And so I thought it was, yeah, a good portrait of some districts.
I think I read that Discovery Channel, Investigative Discovery, is doing a documentary and using a lot of evidence that was left out of Making a Murder.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
I guess this is a question for everyone, but I'm just finishing my thesis in archaeology, and as you know, it's like death. So I was wondering if you had any advice for just getting her done in those last few months.
Oh, it's a grind.
I'm right there with you.
As I tell my students, it's one of the toughest things you'll ever do is writing your thesis. How far along are you, and what level are you at?
I'm finishing my MA thesis to start a PhD in the fall.
Good.
And I've got 3 out of 4 chapters kind of drafted.
Yes?
You know. It's okay.
All I can say is, as I'm sure Mrs. Reichs would say, is that you've got to devote a huge amount of time to it, and you have to grind on it every day. And there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it does turn out to not be an oncoming train. It's good when you get it done.
I viewed it as a full-time job. I had kids, I hired a babysitter, I went to the archaeology lab every day from 9 to 5. I put it on a blackboard, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, whatever, and I just worked at it like it was a full-time job. Because I just wanted the damn thing to be done.
Yes. That's a universally true statement of anybody who writes any large volume of material, is that you're so happy when it's done that it's a liberation putting that final period in and submitting it. So good for you.
Thanks, man.
But that's good advice for writing in general. It's about discipline, being disciplined, having goals.
Absolutely. There's no such thing as writer's block. You just don't allow it. You may not feel like writing on any particular day, but you sit down and you write.
And do you write, do you give yourself a word count? Do you work by hours? How do you
I just
operate?
work all day, every day that I'm at home, basically.
Okay. Because, some authors have a word count that they achieve.
Yeah, no, some days it flows and some days you just sit there. But you stay with it, and you're in charge. It may be, what you write that day may be awful, and the next day you go, what was I thinking? And you hit the delete key. But if you give yourself the luxury of saying, well, the muses are not with me today, that can become the slippery slope.
And do you turn off your internet?
I don't.
That means you're doubly disciplined.
Yeah, well, that doesn't mean I don't take little breaks and sneak out and peek at my email.
Do you delete a lot or do you edit?
I never delete. I cut and I keep what's called a dump file because it's your
Yes.
baby you've created. So I cut it out and I put it in the dump file. I've never ever in 18 books gone back and used anything in the dump file, but it's there.
Yeah, go ahead.
This question is for Dr. Skinner, especially with all of the science that we do see in the media and that my generation grew up on. Do you find that there is a certain amount of shock when you are teaching students and engaging with students that science doesn't work the way they used to see, or it doesn't actually act like that?
I think that actually by the time they get to the university level, they've had the exposure to fire and they've been burnt and they're recovering from it. They know that it's not instantaneous results. But I think that, and Brigitte will probably back me up, when you set out to establish a PhD project, you sit around in the office and you say, oh, let's go ahead and do this. This will be an easy project. It'll take, 3.5 years. And that is usually where we delude ourselves into thinking everything is going to run smoothly. It's going to be so easy. It's like falling off a horse. And the results will come in and we'll have papers coming out of our ears and it'll be wonderful. We all delude ourselves whenever we can, and certainly when we're establishing projects and thinking about them in the future, it happens a lot.
That's what I was saying last week. I think in my thesis, my future work section is going to be exactly what I wrote in my PhD proposal. It's like, I've done none of this, let's put this in future work in my thesis.
Yeah. Great. Yes, go ahead.
So I guess this question would be for Dr. Reichs. In bones, a lot of the time, the way they solve the crime is that they kind of have very expensive, what I would imagine to be expensive and elaborate procedures that they can use. I was just wondering, in the reality, if the police find a body in a dumpster in an average city, what actually can be done and what happens?
Okay, are we talking about the Angelotron? Are you questioning? Yeah, it exists. It is actually a three-dimensional holographic reconstruction apparatus, I believe it's called. Have I ever been in a crime lab that has one? No. Too expensive. So you would not have that available, but you would have some of the same, like three-dimensional, they're called virtual autopsies, are now becoming more common, where you could do that kind of thing that she does with the Angelotron. Most of the other stuff that we have, all of the other stuff that we have on set is actually legitimate medical equipment that we've bought from medical supply houses. So we do have all of that. And any of that, depending, as Brigitte said, if you're in a rural area, you may not have top-notch technology available, but it can be sent. You can bring in expertise from, in Quebec, for example, the Central Crime and Medical Legal Lab is at Parthenay, or in the state of North Carolina, we have an FBI, or a state forensic lab up in Raleigh. You can always have access to the more sophisticated techniques. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
I can't believe we don't have a lineup at the mic, but this is your opportunity, so don't be shy. I want to ask about sort of a feeding off that last question. In real life, do most crimes do all these issues get solved? Because, that's the common denominator with TV and books. There's always a grand conclusion and everything's wrapped up nicely. Is it like that in real life?
They don't all get solved. No, I can't give you a percentage. I don't know if you know a percentage, but
no, it's kind of weird too from this perspective of the forensics lab, because you don't always know what's going on the police end.
Right.
So you send your report and then you're kind of in the black until they ask you to testify,
the
right?
subpoena shows up. The dreaded subpoena shows up.
Okay. So, yes, you don't necessarily know what's solved and what's not.
Could you write a book that ends in failure, or would your readers be mad?
I had one book in which the villain got away. It was my 7th book, Monday Morning. And that came out, when did that come out? 10 years later, I resolved that situation with a follow-up. Okay. Which follows this person from Quebec to, it's the one where the bones were found in the basement of the pizza parlor. Mm-hmm. And that's based on an actual case I worked on these very fragmentary bones were found. They came to my lab. I sorted through. I determined there were 3 people represented. And so the question was, well, how recent was it? Is this a homicide, or was the building built over an old cemetery, or, were they 200 years old or whatever? So I used that as the main theme in Monday Morning. And then 10 years later, and I'm struggling to remember which book it was that followed up and resolved that, but we did. We revisited it. So that was the only time the villain got away, and then she didn't.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Or he.
Yeah, so earlier you guys were talking about communicating science to the lay people and to the common people. Do you guys have any suggestions on how to better do that as like a journalism institution, or for example, Dr. Reichs, you write novels where that can transfer that scientific information to a certain point to the lay people. And Brigitte, you go to high schools and stuff like that. Do you guys have any other opinions and suggestions on how we can better communicate science to the masses?
Have a basic course in maths. That's probably my #1 suggestion, because a lot of studies that you interpret are going to be based on numbers, like what's the sample, what's the test, the statistical test that were used, is that legit, a lot of interpretation is based off of maths, and so I think that I've seen several things recently in the general media regarding maths that made me cringe, especially with regards to survey and giving error rates to survey that come off the net, where you can't actually have a probabilistic answer, and that just makes me really cringe. So that's like my top.
But I think bringing it to the public, there's a lot on Twitter now. There are a number of people that will just, and I do this too, my assistant and I do this, but we just tweet things all the time, links to stories about forensic anthropology or archaeology or bioarchaeology that we think would be of interest to the public to read, so they can link over and constantly read about new Egyptian mummies that have been found, or Jimmy Hoffa was just dug up, or whatever it happens to be. And also you can do a blog. You can do a science blog as well that's geared towards a non-scientific general public, but bringing science to them.
There's a lot of great journals out there also aimed at the curious but non-expert target population. And, like Scientific American, New Scientist, and there's lots of people who publish their research work, and it's intended to be as an intermediate between the technical aspects and the more common person. And there's great shows like Quirks and Quarks and that sort of stuff, and this is a great way of sort of sticking your toes in without getting a full bath. And I think it's important that people think about science and understand what scientists are up to. After all, your tax dollars are paying for our research grants, and so maybe you want to keep an eye on us. I don't know.
Good point.
Great. So we have time for one last question before we wrap up, so go ahead.
My question is mainly for Brigitte. You said at the beginning the whole example you gave at a hospital and like analyzing proteins in a liver and stuff. And I was wondering, is any of that ever done before people die? Because like everything you guys talk about is more like death, right? So is there any preventative measures that you guys help like create policies for or practices?
So the way it's done in the clinical area right now is more by looking at the genetics aspect of it. So you're looking at whether there's a mutation present in the gene that is actually going to create the enzyme that then metabolizes drugs. And so if there's a mutation that is going to wreck the enzyme and make it so that it doesn't work, then you know that this person is not going to metabolize properly with this enzyme. But that kind of doesn't take into account all the environmental factor that can reduce the number of enzymes you have. And so that's why in a postmortem setting, I just take a liver sample because, well, I have access to it, so I would be a fool not just to take it. But of course, this isn't really directly applicable in the clinical domain, because then you'd need to get a biopsy of the liver. And so I'm not sure that this is ever going to happen for the benefit that it gives, right? So this is a very special situation where in postmortem you can actually get more answers because you have access to everything than in the clinical setting. But this is all tied to the personalized medicine area that is developing right now. So yes, that's studied a bit currently.
Pharmaceutical companies are really struggling with this because they've
Yes.
got these great, wonderful candidate drugs and they want to give them to the population, test subjects, but they don't know how they're going to interact with individual people. They've tested them on rats, which is not so good for the rats, but fine. And then they've tested them on cell lines, and the cell lines seem to be fine. But when you move to a human, as Brigitte has said, if you're a great metabolizer and you can handle the drug, no problem. But if you're a poor metabolizer, it can be a real problem. And people have died in these clinical trials. A person died in France, I think it was, a few weeks ago, a month ago. Admittedly, they had taken 40 times the therapeutic dose, and so were intoxicated by the drug. But if we'd had a good model for understanding the pharmacokinetics, then we probably would have been able to predict that happening and stop it from happening. But we don't have that tool. And until people are willing to give up a piece of their liver, it's going to be tough.
Great. So I want to thank especially the audience for coming out tonight. Thank you to Concordia and the Globe and Mail for sponsoring the Thinking Out Loud series. And especially thank you to our three discussants tonight, Brigitte Desharnais, Cameron Skinner, and Kathy Reichs. I'll remind you that there'll be a book signing out front at the right hand, my right, as you go out the exit in a few minutes. And again, thank you, and please join me in thanking our